Hello, welcome to part 2 of my CleaveTech tech tip on preparing for the 2022 Nationals. You can see some progress has been made in regards to body shells have been sprayed. Here we go, got a couple of sports cars, 3 sports car shells, some F1 shells and some saloon shells to try. You can see that my tyres are glued up now onto the rims. They need roughing down, but I have my CleaveTech tyre trimmer to do that with. So that job won't take very long. Make sure you stay watching for the whole video because I'm going to be giving you my special tips on tyre choice for each class. So let's move on to chassis. Here are some chassis that I've got for the different classes. Now, let's have a look at this one here. This is a saloon class of car. So you can see this one here has a Group 12 motor, hence why my gearing 740 on it. So again, the chassis is more or less prepared. I keep them in good condition. If you've watched my video about what happens in the magic box of healing, then if you haven't, take a look at it. I'll put a link on the screen now. But keep my chassis pretty well prepared. So that's more or less ready to go, except it obviously needs the motor and gearing and body shell, etc. for it. But I'm not going to have to do a lot of work to the chassis to get it ready. You can see it's also got all the guide and the lead wires in place. It's even got a set of braids. They're probably good enough for practice, but I will have some spare braids prepared in my box ready for that. So that's a saloon car class. Now, the Formula 1 class of car, then I have a couple of different chassis. This is my Dubic chassis. So again, I've got this, and I've got a couple of Hawkey Formula 1 chassis as well. This was how it raced last time at a different track. I probably wouldn't set it up like this in terms of the weight for the Nationals track that we're going to be racing on. But you can see the inline gears on this one. You can see the tininess of the motor on here. But again, the motor and the gearing, that's all prepared already. I'm happy with all that. These motors, they tend to last quite a long time between services because they're not really that stressed. On something like a 5:30 gear ratio, yes, they're revving quite high, but they're not revving anywhere near as much as a Europort car. They're not dragging the same sort of downforce around the track. They tend to flow a little bit more than a Europort car. Therefore, you're not putting them under so much pressure. So they don't need so much servicing as a Europort motor would. And often, you want these sort of cars to be smoother to drive. So actually a motor that's done some work already and smoothed itself out with slightly less brakes, slightly less torque, might be a much nicer car to drive in the long run. You can also see that I've made a note on the chassis here from the last time I raced of what type of tyres I had on the car. So I've got a code for the type of tyre, the diameter of it, and what clearance it gave me on the car. Obviously, that's not necessarily what it's got on it now. They're just whatever was left at the end of the race. Again, I've made a note of that. But just to explain the note that was on the chassis. So again, I'll give the chassis a general check over, make sure it's flat and straight, but not too much work to do on this chassis. The final class of car is a Europort chassis. Again, using an open motor. Again, I keep all my chassis in pretty good condition. So this one, again, is all ready. It's all nice and flat and straight. It may not be the motor that I'm going to use. This motor was put in for a little bit of testing at a track that I went to fairly recently. It's probably not the motor I'm going to be using on our Nationals track. I tend to save my ideal ones for that track just for the much larger events and maybe the World Championships. But the chassis again is all ready. So again, not too much work to do on my chassis apart from a general check over and make sure it's flat and straight. I may be changing the guide height setup. Again, if you haven't seen my video on setting up guide height, I'll put a link on the screen now. But if I show you a little close up here, you can see that that motor there actually has a 6-tooth pinion on it, not a 5. So this was going to run 644 gearing because this is a motor that perhaps doesn't have so much top end, so it needs a little bit different gear ratio to give it that top end. And it smooths it out quite nicely as well. But as I say, this motor is probably not the motor I'm going to be using for the National Championships. So you can see from the cars there in the picture there, I've got 3 chassis for the saloon class. I've got 3 chassis for the Formula 1 class. I've actually got 4 chassis there for the sports class, and I've probably got a few more that I might take with me anyway, just for emergencies, because you always get a little bit more time for testing sports cars for some reason. The practice session for those is fairly good. We don't get much practice for the saloon class because that's the very first day, but when that's over, we get some practice for Formula 1 and practice for Eurosport classes. So again, you get to try out and experiment a few more things. Now, as I said, I've probably got 4 chassis or more for the Eurosport class. There's probably only 2 chassis that I will be using, but it can be quite handy in that class, especially if it's dominated by motor performance a lot of the time. It's handy to have other chassis so you can test a range of motors in a shorter space of time, because you can have all your motors in different chassis, and at least then you get some idea of the performance of the motor rather than having to keep swapping it in and out of one particular chassis all the time and putting miles on maybe your best race chassis. So there's probably only 2 or 3 chassis there that I would even consider running once I've found the best motors to use. So now you've seen the chassis, what about the motors? Well, some motors are used already, but they're motors that I wouldn't consider using on that track. Perhaps they don't have the ultimate performance. Perhaps their performance is more suited for shorter, tighter tracks. So you can see number 14, number 28 there, I'm not going to be using. They're not even in the box. They might even be in cars already. In fact, you've probably seen one of them in a car that I've just showed you. So let's have a look here. Yes, so you can see maybe that's number 21. So that's that motor there. It's in this car, say, from a previous test, but it will come out again. It's only done about 5 minutes of running, so it will come out and go back in the box. It won't need a service after 5 minutes of running. But some of the other motors, again, might be in cars. They might be off for a service. But I do have a few under here, as you can see, ready to go. They might need pinions putting on them, but they're all ready for the National Championships. Let's have a look at this one, for example. Here, I'll bring in and you can take a closer look. So here is a typical Eurosport motor. This one's ready to go. Just had a service by Dave Harvey at 101. So it's been balanced, comtrued and reassembled. Nice new brushes, new springs, etc. All ready for the event. The shaft on the end is 1.2 millimeters. So again, that's ready for a 5 millimeter pinion, or sorry, a 5-tooth pinion. Nicely made. These are lovely bits of kit from Cahosa. There are other manufacturers of motors, but I do like the Cahosa motors. They do come assembled very nicely. It's got a small notch in here to allow the axle of the car to just pass the can and to be able to get the ideal ratio that I want. You can see that the windings are all very nice, high quality. I think this one has a PK armature in it. I think they're good manufacturer of open arms. Again, there are other people that make open arms, such as Velico and maybe S&K. They're the most popular open arms. I know Coford make open arms, ProSlot make open arms. When I say open arms, armatures that you can have wound to any specification you would like. But I've tended to use PK armatures in these kind of classes. I do have a fair few Velico armatures as well that work very, very well. And in fact, that number 21 motor you've just seen had a Velico armature in it, but this one just happens to have a PK armature in it. Again, exact winds, exact specifications of motors, I might save for my Tech Tip Extra. But just to let you know, this is a typical kind of Eurosport motor that we will be running in our 30-second Eurosport class. So how many motors might I need? Well, again, I'd say probably 3 motors for each class minimum, because you're probably going to need a motor for the heats and a motor for the finals, and maybe a motor to practice round with as well. So you probably save your best motor for the final, your next best motor for the heat, and maybe practice with the worst motor that you've got. Formula 1 class, not so many, because again, the motors aren't stressed so much, and you can do all your practice, all your heats and final probably with the same motor without needing to change. But in the other 2 classes, in Group 12 and Eurosport, I'd probably suggest changing the motor between the heats and the finals. But again, it depends on how you're driven. You know, you can drive in a certain way, you can set controller settings to save a motor to make sure it's going to be much stronger later on. So if perhaps you've only got one really, really good motor, again, it might be good enough to get you through the heat into the final, so you can save it in terms of your controller settings, and then hopefully wind it up a bit for the final and go and blitz them all and win. But I would recommend having a minimum of 3 motors for each class. I haven't done a series on motor rebuilding, but I will be. I'll include some motor rebuilding tech tips coming soon. Again, there'll be also some special tech tip extras on motor building and motor specs and what different specs of motor affect its performance. So keep an eye out for those in the future too. So back to the tyres. Well, these are my glued up tyres for the event. I have some more that I've glued up previously to choose from as well. But a couple of these are a new compound that I'm going to try out. They obviously need roughing down, so I'm going to use my CleaveTech tyre trimmer on my hoodie to make a quick job of that. If you haven't seen the video on my tyre trimmer, I'll put a link up here now. Have a look. It's a very useful attachment for your hoodie. So what about tyre choice for different classes then? Well, I showed you this chassis, or I think I've shown you this chassis before. This is a saloon car chassis that uses the saloon body shells and a Group 12 motor. I think it's class 3 in the BSCRA rules. Again, I'll put a link to the BSCRA rules in the video description down below. But these type of cars with a saloon shell, they don't like tyres that are quite so soft. If you tend to run soft tyres on the car, they tend to, round the corners, they tend to bog down quite a lot and they can be quite tippy. With a saloon car, you want the back to be able to move around a little bit more on the track to make it more drivable and to make it change direction better, because there isn't much downforce on the car itself. So I tend on this kind of class of car to use a slightly harder tyre where I can, because often a harder tyre means slightly less grip. Something like a Klingon tyre is quite a soft tyre, which is fine probably for your club type racing where there perhaps isn't so much grip on the track. But when you come to a big event and the grip's built up and the rubber's built up, you might want to be able to go to a harder tyre, especially on really fast sweeping corners. But say on maybe slow corners where the car's not going to bog down so much at speed, then you could get away with a softer tyre. So I'm probably not going to be running Klingons on my saloon car. Also, you've got to consider wear rate as well, because at the National Championships we have a heat of 8x3 minutes and then we have a final of 8x4 minutes. So of course you can change tyres, but you must do it during race time. Therefore, if your tyres run down and they're too small, you have to change them during the race. Therefore, you're going to lose a few laps. But again, you don't want to start with tyres that are perhaps too big and have the car falling over. So it's having a good wear rate on your tyres as well. And something like maybe a Klingon tyre may not last the whole race on a saloon car. However, there is an aside to this. You could have some treated Klingons. Now, treated Klingons are tyres that perhaps have had some of the oils dried out of them. They've been treated with a chemical and dried out, which makes them slightly firmer, slightly harder and longer wearing. So they might do the job quite nicely. But as I say, I need to test some tyres first before I know exactly what I'm going to be using. I have an idea, I know what I used last year, but I do want to try something a little bit different this year because I didn't win that class last year. So then we move on to the Formula 1 class. Again, uses these type of Formula 1 body shells here. Now, on a Formula 1 class, the tyre wear is nowhere near so high as you get on some of the other classes because the cornering speeds aren't that great with a Formula 1 car. They don't quite handle as well as all the other classes. They have a fast motor, but again, they don't really corner anywhere near as fast, so the cornering forces on the tyres tend not to wear them. One thing you do have to watch out for is the edges of the tyres. Depending on how you drive your Formula 1 car, you can end up chewing up the edges of the tyres. Now you can see on here that one started to wear, but this has done a race already. These tyres have done a 6x4 minute race, so they've lasted quite well. But again, it depends on your driving style. I know somebody who likes the back end of their car wiggling around like mad, who puts the power on really early out of corners, gets some really fast laps. Don't know how they do it, but they do mash their tyres. I'm a much smoother driver. I don't tend to let the back of the car wiggle around a lot. I tend to apply the power rather smoothly, which maybe sometimes is slightly slower out the corners, but my tyres do last quite well. So something to watch is the edges of your tyres. And as I've explained in a previous video about hub size, and if you haven't seen that, I'll put a link on the screen up here. Hub size can dictate how much grip you get, but it can also dictate how long the tyres last as well, in that smaller hubs gives you more rubber on the edge and stops it from tearing. Now you can see on here, this one's got Klingon 17s on it, and they work quite nicely on a Formula 1 car. They're very grippy tyres, they're quite soft tyres, so they give you a nice amount of grip. So maybe I could be using Klingons on a Formula 1 car, and I know they will last the whole race. I think these are Class 1 on the BSCRA rule set, if you happen to have had a look at the BSCRA rules already. And our final class is 32nd Europort, which I think is Class 2 on the BSCRA rules list. Again, these use these really high downforce BSP K slot car cap body shells. Because the downforce on these chassis is very high, again, your tyre choice is really dependent on your driving style, the length of race, and how much grip is down by this time of the event. Sometimes, depending on how many people are racing, there will be a lot of rubber on the track by this stage. Therefore, you need a tyre that's going to work with a lot of rubber on the track. It's also worth finding out perhaps what other people have been using, because if you know what a lot of people have been using on the track, then you know that there's perhaps more of that rubber down than anything else. And often tyres work very well on likewise rubber on the track. So when you're running like handout tyres on an event, handout tyres can work really well by the end of the event because the track's just covered in the same rubber and they grip really nicely, but they may not work with other rubber. So really the Europort class is a little bit of a testing event and trying some different tyres to see what's going to work at that time of the event, depending on temperature and, as I say, how many people have run, the motor you've got in your car and your chassis setup. Europort cars are quite hard wearing on tyres because they corner really fast. So you need to make sure that you've got a tyre that is going to perhaps last the race, or if it's not going to last the race, you start at a size that means that you're changing at an optimum time, whether it be changing on an optimum lane, whether it be changing halfway through the race to make the best use of both sizes of tyre. But again, planning a tyre change into your race could be possible. It can often be quicker in a race to start a race with a lower ground clearance, run the race, change the tyres maybe halfway through, and again, run again with a fairly lower clearance, and maybe lose, 3 laps on a tyre change, than start with tyres that are absolutely massive, have a bad handling car, and lose more than 3 laps just through a bad handling car. So to sum that up, I'm not really sure what tyres I'm going to be using on my Europort cars. Probably something that's fairly hard wearing, relying on the downforce and the setup of the car to give me the grip that I need. So it's likely to be a harder tyre, maybe with slightly less grip, but does last for a longer period of time. So again, maybe my treated Klingons might do the job this time round, I don't know, but we'll have to see. Other manufacturers of tyres are available, as you know. JK is a popular make for tyres. They come up with some really good tyres from time to time, so it's often worth buying a batch of tyres and trying them out, a small batch of tyres, trying them out. That's pretty much what I'm doing here. I've got some brands of tyres here to try out, some different batches of tyres, because they're not all the same. Tyres that you might buy in January of a year might be different to the tyres you might buy in October of that same year. You could even buy them from the same supplier, but they might be from a different sheet of tyre, a different batch of tyre, so they're going to have a different amount of grip and a slightly different rating in terms of hardness even. I will in the future be doing a video on tyres in more detail, probably on my Tech Tip Extra series that I'll be starting up soon, because I'll go into like the hardness of tyres and again how to maybe select your tyres a little bit more appropriately for the event. Thank you for watching another CleaveTech Tech Tip. We're racing this weekend, so I'll try and keep you informed of how things are going. I might even be able to do a video of what's happening at the event. There might even be some recorded live tech tips happening as well. Since last week's video, I've also been busy preparing Formula 1 gears as well. Trimmed them all down, lightened them up, balanced them up, You can see this is a 33 tooth S&K 72 pitch Formula 1 gear. So I prepared quite a few of those, so that should keep me going for a few events throughout the year. I also finished preparing my gears for the other classes as well, which are all bagged up nicely in there. So once again, thank you very much for watching. If you haven't subscribed already, please press the big C there, subscribe. You might know some armatures here. They're for testing later on. They're probably for 24th Open Group 12 they are, but they're for testing later on. But I'm taking them with me. I need to do some measurements on them with a friend's tool. Sounds a bit dodgy, but it isn't. But as I say, subscribe, hit the big C, and watch some of my other videos, and enjoy your racing. And I'll be back again next week. See you soon.